Introduction. Welcome viewers. In this video, we'll be doing a deep dive into how short-term rental platforms like Airbnb impact local housing markets. This topic has been hotly debated as Airbnb has grown to become a major player in tourism and housing over the past decade. While Airbnb offers clear benefits for travelers and hosts, cities from New York to Paris have blamed its rapid growth for eating up rental housing supply, driving up rents, disrupting neighborhoods, and exacerbating over-tourism. In response, many municipalities have started imposing strict regulations to limit short-term rentals, but striking the right policy balance remains tricky. Opponents argue these rules go too far and unfairly impact hosts relying on rental income. So how should cities address complaints about Airbnb's effects on housing? Does the platform provide income opportunities and tourist accommodations that outweigh any downsides? To unpack this complex issue, we'll start with an overview of Airbnb itself and how the platform operates. Next, we'll look at New York City's recent passage of some of the strictest Airbnb restrictions in the US, which many consider a de facto ban. We'll hear arguments from both supporters and critics of New York's approach. Expanding beyond just New York, we'll also examine Airbnb's impacts on housing markets in smaller cities and tourist destinations. And we'll look at how regulations can negatively affect hosts relying on short-term rental income. Finally, we'll weigh the overall pros and cons of this new wave of restrictions and discuss balanced policy solutions. There are reasoned points on both sides of this debate, so we'll dig into all the nuances around Airbnb's disruption of local housing markets. By the end, you'll have a fuller picture of this complex issue. Let's get started. Part 1. The rise of Airbnb. To understand the controversy around Airbnb's effects on housing, we first need to understand how the platform operates and its meteoric growth over the past decade. Airbnb was founded in 2008 in San Francisco by tech entrepreneurs Brian Chesky, Joe Gebbia, and Nathan Blecharczyk. They came up with the home sharing idea as a way to earn extra cash by renting floor space in their apartment to attendees of a local design conference when hotels were fully booked. Their makeshift rental business was a success, so the founders built a platform to connect other people looking to rent out spare rooms or empty homes with travelers seeking more space, amenities, and local authenticity than typical hotels could provide. Airbnb takes a brokerage commission on every booking. The concept of short-term home and room rentals quickly caught on. Airbnb bookings exploded from just 2 million in 2012 to over 100 million in 2018. Its global inventory now exceeds over 5 million active listings in 220 countries worldwide. In 2019, Airbnb went public in one of the largest tech IPOs ever, debuting with a valuation over $47 billion. The company proved everyday people could earn substantial income by temporarily renting their lived-in or second homes to visitors on a massive scale. For many hosts, Airbnb income helped ease housing affordability burdens in expensive cities. But as the platform rapidly expanded in major cities like New York, Amsterdam, Barcelona, and others, complaints started to grow about negative impacts to local housing markets in residential neighborhoods. Officials and housing advocates argued Airbnb was reducing rental housing supply, driving up rents, and bringing hotel-like nuisance issues into apartment buildings as short-term guests flowed through units. This public debate kicked off a wave of regulation as local governments sought to limit these impacts. New York City recently implemented some of the strictest restrictions yet in any major U.S. city, essentially eliminating most short-term listings. But striking the right policy balance continues to prove difficult, given Airbnb's popularity with tourists and hosts. Let's look deeper at New York's approach. Part 2. New York City's crackdown on short-term rentals. In 2022, New York City enacted Local Law 18, imposing tight new restrictions on short-term rental platforms like Airbnb, effective as of September 2022. The regulations were spurred by years of complaints about the platform's effects on housing availability and affordability. The new law requires short-term rental hosts to register with the city's Office of Special Enforcement, provide identifying information, and submit to periodic audits. But the crucial part is hosts must actually live in the home they are renting short-term and be present for the duration of any rental. Units can only host up to 2 guests maximum. This new set of eligibility conditions effectively eliminates the vast majority of typical short-term listings. Apartments or second homes hosts rent out when they are not there, unless a unit is their primary residence, and the host remains present throughout. It cannot legally operate as a short-term rental in New York City under the new law. The impact on supply is immense. Nearly 22,500 units were previously rented short-term in New York, bringing in over $85 million of revenue in 2022. but now only a fraction of true home shares stand to qualify under the strict new rules. Airbnb attempted to block the legislation, filing a federal lawsuit arguing it violated hosts' constitutional rights and was improperly targeting interstate commerce activity. But a judge dismissed the suit in August 2022, clearing the way for enforcement. The city maintains tight limits became necessary to curb what it saw as Airbnb's excessive impacts on the local housing market. Let's look at the arguments made by supporters of New York's tough new restrictions. Part 3: Arguments that Airbnb harms local housing. Supporters of New York's strict crackdown on short-term rentals like Airbnb present several arguments for why the platform's growth necessitated action, reduced housing supply. First, units frequently rented short-term on Airbnb platforms are taken out of the long-term rental housing market. A McGill University study of Airbnb listings in New York from 2014 to 2017 found over 10% were booked more than 3 months total per year, essentially operating year-round as hotel units rather than residences. Given New York City's housing crunch with an estimated shortage of around 575,000 affordable rental units, converting apartments into short-term units further reduces supply. According to housing conservation coordinators, a local nonprofit, Airbnb removed between 7,000 and 13,500 units of housing in 2018 alone. With supply lowered, rents increased citywide. One study by researchers at UCLA and USC found neighborhoods in New York with the most Airbnb concentration saw average rents increase by 1.4% compared to otherwise comparable neighborhoods. This equates to an over 30% total rent increase over 8 years in heavy Airbnb areas. Disruptions for residents. In addition to reducing housing supply, supporters argue short-term Airbnb guests bring quality of life disruptions to residential buildings not meant to accommodate hotel-like traffic. The city's City Planning Commission estimates nearly two-thirds of active Airbnb listings in New York are technically illegal under short-term rental laws preceding the 2022 crackdown. Unlawful listings largely operated without regulation or oversight. As a result, New York City government received over 7,000 complaints about Airbnb units causing problems in 2021 alone. Issues ranged from loud late-night parties to public intoxication and violence, unauthorized guests refusing to leave, and vandalism of common spaces. Having new groups of strangers flowing in and out frequently creates safety risks and nuisances for full-time residents in Airbnb heavy buildings, overwhelming local neighborhoods. Additionally, supporters argue too many Airbnbs flooded popular New York City residential neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, Chelsea, and Williamsburg with a constant churn of tourists. This overwhelmed local restaurants, transit systems, and public spaces. It eroded the character and community feel as residents competed with a never-ending stream of visitors. Advocates say excessive short-term rentals also led wealthier landlords in these neighborhoods to illegally deregulate units or refuse to renew leases, further displacing lower-income tenants. Strict limits can help counteract these effects. Potential to create affordable housing. Given these arguments, supporters contend reducing short-term rental units could convert thousands of apartments back into much-needed long-term affordable housing. One estimate by housing conservation coordinators found just eliminating frequently rented Airbnb units could return anywhere from 5,000 to 12,800 affordable housing units back into circulation in New York. This could put a major dent in the city's housing shortage. While Airbnb disputes its contributions to reduce supply and higher rents, local officials and housing advocates see ample reason to strictly regulate short-term rental platforms to open up housing access for more New York residents. Part 4: Concerns about overly strict regulations. However, critics of New York's approach argue the city's stringent new short-term rental regulations go too far and impose unfair burdens. Small host impacts. First, smaller home-sharing hosts say the rules penalize them the same as larger commercial operators with multiple listings that function essentially as illegal hotels. Hosts like Margaret Moore Roberts, who rented her basement apartment in a two-family Brooklyn brownstone on Airbnb, used the income to afford her overall housing costs. But she and hosts like her can no longer list their units part-time under the strict regulations. Advocacy groups like Restore Homeowner Autonomy and rights argue everyday New Yorkers trying to earn supplemental income are unfairly looped in with commercial landlords wrongly running mini hotel businesses out of residential buildings. They want New York to amend the law to allow small-scale hosts who live on site to continue short-term renting without overly burdensome red tape. This more surgical approach would still restrict larger operators. Economic impacts. Additionally, critics argue most hosts use Airbnb to afford housing in an expensive city, not to run unlawful hotels. Airbnb claims over 93% of hosts worldwide share only their primary or secondary residence, not multiple investment properties. Eliminating or severely restricting their home sharing income risks economic instability for hosts relying on the money to pay mortgages, rents, and other bills. The regulations also mean less income spent by tourists at local businesses. Airbnb claims guests stayed over 37 million nights and generated $4.7 billion in local economic activity across New York City in 2021 alone. Strict limits shrink this benefit. Over-tourism solutions exist. Finally, some argue cities can address complaints of over-tourism in certain neighborhoods with better zoning rules. For example, banning short-term rentals in residential zones, but permitting them in designated commercial hotel districts. Rather than citywide bans or extreme limitations, tailored regulations are a compromise approach. Reasonable restrictions paired with enforcement of existing laws on illegal hotels could curb commercial abuses without harming average hosts. While New York sees its strict rules as justified, critics argue a scalpel is needed, not a sledgehammer. Less restrictive alternatives could achieve housing policy goals without the same unintended consequences. Part 5: Airbnb's impact on housing in smaller cities. So far we've focused on New York, but Airbnb's effects on housing extend to smaller cities and tourist destinations as well. In some cases, the impacts may be even more outsized relative to overall housing supply. For example, in South Lake Tahoe, a vacation destination straddling California and Nevada, nearly 1 in every 4 homes are Airbnb rentals. With limited housing stock to begin with, heavy short-term rental activity squeezes full-time residents out of homes and rentals. According to one study, median monthly rent in South Lake Tahoe rose 42% from 2014 to 2019, while median incomes only increased 15%. The city had to impose a cap on new licenses for short-term rentals to cool the market. Big Sky, Montana has faced similar pressures as a popular ski town with a small permanent population. There, officials found nearly 16% of residential properties had fully converted from housing locals to operating as short-term rentals. This severely shrunk available long-term housing, so Big Sky also enacted moderate cap in licensing policies to curb the short-term rental market. Even smaller cities and towns are impacted. A study in Bozeman, Montana estimated between 1,500 and 2,200 units listed on Airbnb consumed about 10 to 15% of the total rental housing supply in the city. In Durham, North Carolina, researchers found nearly half of Airbnb hosts were essentially running professional operations with multiple property listings, not true home sharing. Removing so much housing stock for the short-term rental market in turn makes housing less affordable for long-term residents. While regulations in huge travel hubs like New York City grab headlines, even smaller tourist destinations are recognizing short-term rentals' outsized impacts on scarce housing. Tailored policies to balance tourism activity with long-term resident needs are emerging in response. Part 6: Weighing regulations versus home-sharing income. Stepping back from specific cities, the rise of Airbnb has sparked a complex policy debate. How should cities balance the benefits of short-term rentals with their impacts on reducing housing supply for residents? On the one hand, Airbnb provides valuable income to hosts. During the pandemic, many came to rely even more heavily on home-sharing earnings amid job losses in other sectors. Banning or severely limiting this earning opportunity risks economic hardship for middle-class homeowners. It also reduces travel accommodations for tourists. But critics argue cities should prioritize housing availability and affordability for long-term residents over short-term rental activity. The home-sharing model incentivizes changing permanent housing into temporary units, which compounds shortages. Cities have few tools to address housing issues, so reining in Airbnb is viewed as necessary. There are also reasonable arguments around limiting over-tourism and neighborhood disruptions caused by transient visitors in residential areas. But small-scale hosts counter that regulations should target large operators, not responsible home-sharing. Overall, there are merits to both perspectives in this ongoing debate. Nuanced policy solutions could allow some degree of home sharing where it doesn't overly infringe on housing supply for locals. Imposing reasonable limits in residential zones but allowing short-term rentals in commercial zones may strike a balance. What does seem clear is the tide has shifted globally towards more local regulation of short-term rental platforms. But achieving fair, balanced policies that take into account impacts on tourism, hosts, and the housing market remains an ongoing challenge. Conclusion. To wrap up, in this video we've explored the rise of short-term rental platforms like Airbnb and their increasingly controversial impacts on local housing. Looking closely at New York City's recent crackdown on short-term listings, we reviewed arguments that limiting Airbnb units is necessary to counteract negative effects on housing affordability, residential neighborhoods, and over-tourism. But we also examined counterpoints that overly restrictive policies go too far and unfairly penalize smaller-scale hosts who rely on home-sharing income without targeting larger commercial operators. And we discussed how even smaller tourist destinations are grappling with balancing housing needs for residents with the benefits and costs of surging short-term rentals. Clearly, this complex issue has multiple valid perspectives. But local governments globally seem increasingly willing to enact regulations, even at the objection of Airbnb and hosts who oppose overly stringent limitations. Going forward, crafting balanced policies that allow a degree of home sharing where appropriate, while protecting long-term housing inventory remains a key challenge. But the days of short-term rental platforms operating with little oversight appear to be ending. That wraps up our deep dive on this hotly debated topic. Thank you for watching and let me know your thoughts in the comments.